There is a place in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that should not exist the way it exists, not because it is unusual for a culture to build on water. The world has floating villages and stilt cities and civilizations that learn to live between land and sea. That is not unusual. Human ingenuity in the face of geography is one of the oldest stories on Earth. And not because it is unusual for an ancient society to move large stones. Every major civilization that preceded us left behind evidence of extraordinary engineering. Blocks lifted, transported, fitted together in ways that continue to astonish engineers who study them today. But Nan Madol, that impossible archipelago of artificial islands rising from a shallow coral reef off the eastern coast of the island of Pohnpei in the Federated States of Micronesia, has been accumulating a category of impossibility that is different in kind from either of those things. The impossibility is not just what was built, it is where it was built, and how, and from what, and what has been found beneath it, and what no one has been able to explain about any of those things, despite more than a century of formal academic investigation. You probably know the surface of this story. You have seen photographs, aerial images of stone walls rising from teal water, geometric corridors filling with tide, the angular geometry of a dead city still standing in the ocean like something that refused to accept its own ruin. The images are striking enough that Nan Madol has appeared in every major list of the world's ancient mysteries for as long as those lists have been made. But the surface of this story is the least interesting part of it. The interesting part is what is underneath. Literally underneath, beneath the water, beneath the reef, beneath the layers of sediment that have accumulated around the base of these structures for centuries. And figuratively underneath, beneath the published academic record, beneath the careful institutional language that researchers use when they are describing something they do not have a framework to explain, beneath the silence that has accumulated around certain findings, in the same way that sediment accumulates around submerged stone. Tonight, we are going to go through all of it, slowly, carefully, without rushing past the parts that are hard to explain. There are 30 things about Nan Madol, about its construction, its purpose, its abandonment, its submerged extensions, its anomalous physical properties, and the institutional pattern that has developed around its most uncomfortable questions that mainstream archaeology has not been able to fully account for. 30 threads in a picture that, when you lay them side by side, begins to suggest something much older, much more deliberate, and much more complex than a ceremonial city built by a medieval island culture with an enthusiasm for large rocks. Find a comfortable position. Let your body settle. This is a long story, and it deserves to be told the way the ocean tells its stories, with patience, with depth, and with the understanding that the most important things are rarely visible from the surface. Let us start at the beginning. Before you can understand what is strange about Nan Madol, you need to understand what it actually is. Not in the tourist brochure sense, ancient wonder of Micronesia, UNESCO World Heritage Site, must-see destination, but in the physical, geological, engineering sense. Because when you look at it that way, before you have even gotten to the mysteries, before you have even begun to ask the questions that this account is going to spend its full length exploring, Nan Madol is already something that should give you pause. Nan Madol is a city built on a coral reef. Not near a coral reef. Not adjacent to one, with the buildings on dry land and the reef as a geographic feature nearby. On one, directly on a living coral reef in the shallow lagoon off the southeastern coast of Pohnpei, where the water depth ranges from about half a meter at low tide to perhaps 4 or 5 meters in the deeper channels between the artificial islands. There are 92 of those artificial islands. 92 separate land masses, each one constructed by placing stone on the reef until the stone rose above the waterline and created a platform that could support construction. The total area covered by this process, the combined footprint of 92 artificial islands, plus the network of tidal channels that runs between them like a system of streets, is approximately 18 square kilometers. The stone used to build these islands and the structures on them is basalt. Columnar basalt, the kind that forms when lava cools rapidly and contracts into roughly hexagonal columns, like a natural architecture that the earth produces when it is in the right mood. The columns at Nan Madol are not quarried blocks. They were not cut from a quarry face with chisels and shaped to specification. They are natural basalt columns that were transported from their geological source, which is on the other side of Pohnpei at a location called Soka's Rock, approximately 25 to 30 kilometers away by sea, and stacked in alternating horizontal and vertical layers to create walls up to 9 meters high and 7 meters thick at their base. The total volume of basalt incorporated into the construction of Nan Madol has been estimated at somewhere between 750,000 and 1 million metric tons. Some individual columns weigh up to 50 tons. The civilization that built Nan Madol, the Sotalur dynasty, which ruled Pohnpei from approximately 1100 CEE to 1628 CE, with the primary construction phase of Nan Madol estimated to date from roughly 1200 CE onwards, did not have metal tools. They did not have wheeled vehicles. They did not have cranes or pulleys of the kind that mechanical advantage calculations would require for moving 50-ton stones. They were a sophisticated Pacific Island culture with exceptional maritime ability, a complex social and ceremonial structure, and a tradition of working with stone that produced results that continue to baffle modern engineers. That is the baseline. That is what is officially known and officially accepted about Nan Madol before you start asking uncomfortable questions. And even at the baseline level, before you have opened a single disputed archive or spoken to a single marginalized researcher, what you are looking at is a construction achievement that the standard archaeological model has significant difficulty accounting for. Not impossible, exactly. Possible, probably, with enough people and enough time and enough organizational will, but difficult to model in a way that the numbers work cleanly. Difficult enough that when engineers who specialize in logistics and heavy material movement look at Nan Madol, they tend to say things like theoretically feasible in the careful tone of people who are not entirely sure they believe what they are saying. Theoretically feasible is where the story starts. What it becomes from there is something considerably more interesting. There is a particular way of seeing Nan Madol that changes something in the way the brain processes what it is looking at. It is not the ground-level view, where you stand in a boat in one of the tidal channels between the artificial islands and look up at the basalt walls rising on either side of you. That view is impressive. The scale and the geometry and the age of it communicate themselves directly, viscerally, without the need for interpretation. But it does not show you the thing that needs to be seen. The view that does that is the aerial view. The drone footage or the satellite image that puts you above the site and lets you see its full extent, all 18 square kilometers of it, the 92 islands arranged in their pattern, the channels running between them, the larger ceremonial compounds rising at specific locations within the overall grid. When you see that view for the first time, something happens in the mind that is difficult to articulate precisely. It is not quite recognition. You have not seen this place before, but it is something adjacent to recognition. A sense that the pattern you are looking at is not random. That the arrangement of those 92 islands is not the arrangement you would expect from an organic, incremental process of construction growing naturally over centuries. It is too regular. The channels are too straight. The orientation of the major compounds relative to each other and to the cardinal directions is too consistent. The word that tends to come up when people describe that aerial view without knowing they are using the same word that researchers have used in formal contexts is planned. It looks planned. It looks like the result of a design decision made before construction began, not like the accumulated result of generations of piecemeal addition. That impression, the impression of prior design at a scale that implies a sophistication of planning that is difficult to fit into the standard model of what the Saudeleur dynasty was, is the first thread. And it does not go away the more carefully you look. It gets stronger. Here is what this account is going to cover, and why it matters. The visible Nan Madol, the parts above water, the parts that tourists visit, and UNESCO has listed, and archaeologists have measured and photographed and debated, is remarkable. It is one of the most significant archaeological sites in the Pacific, and the formal scholarly attention it has received over the past century has produced a substantial body of knowledge about its surface features, its construction techniques as best as they can be inferred, and its ceremonial and political functions within the Saudeleur system of governance. But the visible Nan Madol is, according to evidence that has been accumulating from multiple independent sources since systematic investigation of the site began in the 19th century, only part of what Nan Madol is. The other part is underwater, submerged beneath the tidal channels and the lagoon floor surrounding the site. Hidden by sediment and coral growth, and the 5 centuries that have passed since the city was abandoned. Not entirely unknown, the existence of submerged structures at Nan Madol has been noted in exploration accounts, diving records, and scientific survey reports going back more than 100 years, but not fully investigated, not mapped to a resolution that would allow definitive conclusions, and in certain cases, actively avoided by divers who encountered things that they found difficult to explain and chose not to investigate further. That is the territory this account is going to cover. The above-water impossibilities and the below-water ones. the official record and the unofficial one. The questions that formal archaeology has asked, and the questions it has consistently not asked. The findings that were published and the findings that were noted in field notebooks and personal correspondence, and then not included in the papers that came out of the same expeditions. And at the center of all of it, the question that nobody in a formal scientific context has been willing to ask directly, in the language that the evidence seems to require. What was this place really for? And who, or what, made the decisions that are reflected in its design? Those questions do not have clean answers. This account will not offer you clean answers, because clean answers in the face of evidence like this would be dishonest. What this account will offer you is the evidence, assembled carefully and completely, so that you can sit with it and feel the weight of what 60-plus years of intermittent, impeded, institutionally cautious investigation has been building toward. The Pacific does not give up its secrets easily. The reef keeps what it holds, but the pieces have been accumulating quietly in archives and dive logs and field notebooks and the private reflections of researchers who got close enough to understand that what they were looking at was not adequately explained by what the textbooks said. Tonight, we assemble the pieces. The basalt question is where every serious examination of Nan Madol has to begin, because the basalt question is the one that engineering cannot answer without straining. Columnar basalt is not rare in the Pacific. The volcanic geology of Micronesia produces it at multiple locations across the region, and Pohnpei itself has significant basalt deposits. The particular source that geochemical analysis of the Nan Madol construction material has identified, the basalt columns used in the site's construction, are geochemically consistent with sources on the northwestern end of Pohnpei, particularly around the Sokes Peninsula, is roughly 25 to 30 kilometers from the construction site, measured along the most practical maritime route. 25 to 30 kilometers of open ocean, with 50-ton stones, on rafts. This is not a new observation. It has been made by every researcher who has looked seriously at Nan Madol's construction since the site entered the formal archaeological literature in the late 19th century. And the responses to it have always followed the same pattern. Yes, it was challenging, but Pacific Islanders were extraordinary mariners, and with sufficient numbers of people and sufficient time, the transportation of large stones by raft is not beyond the range of documented human capability. This is true. It is not wrong. The transportation of large stones by raft across significant bodies of water has been accomplished by human cultures in multiple parts of the world and in multiple time periods. The basalt columns of Nan Madol did not teleport themselves into position. They were moved by people, using whatever technologies and techniques those people had developed for the purpose. But here is what the response to the basalt question tends to glide past, and what becomes interesting when you sit with it more carefully. The estimate of 1 million metric tons of basalt, even the more conservative estimate of 750,000 metric tons, is staggering in what it implies about the duration and scale of the transportation effort required to accomplish it. Engineers and logisticians who have done the calculation have arrived at numbers that imply decades of continuous, large-scale organized labor dedicated to nothing but the transportation of stone from source to site. Not occasional construction, not intermittent activity across a long period. Sustained, organized, continuous large-scale effort. That level of organized labor implies a society capable of marshaling and directing it, a social and administrative structure sophisticated enough to coordinate the activities of hundreds or perhaps thousands of people over extended periods toward a single architectural goal. The Saudeleur dynasty was sophisticated. The archaeological record of Pohnpei makes that clear. But the sophistication required to organize the Nan Madol construction effort, even on the most conservative estimate of its scale, is at the outer limit of what the standard model of the Saudeleur's organizational capacity can accommodate. The numbers work, just barely. But they work the way a calculation that proves something theoretically possible works, by excluding the messy real-world variables that would be present in an actual multi-decade maritime stone transportation operation. The basalt columns of Nan Madol have been studied not just for where they came from, but for how they were used. And the way they were used is one of the more interesting puzzles about the site, because the construction technique employed at Nan Madol is not what you would expect from a culture that was simply stacking available natural materials as efficiently as possible. The columns are laid in a specific pattern, alternating layers of horizontal and vertical placement, each layer running perpendicular to the one beneath it. This creates what engineers call a log cabin joint, a structural system that distributes load and resists lateral movement in ways that random stacking would not. It is a sophisticated construction technique that produces greater structural stability than the simpler approach of simply placing stones one atop another. This technique requires planning. It requires that the people placing the stones understood the structural logic of what they were building well enough to execute it consistently across the entire site, in multiple construction phases, over what the archaeological evidence suggests was a period of several centuries. It requires, in other words, a knowledge system for construction that was not improvised on the spot, but was developed, codified, transmitted, and applied with consistency across time. That knowledge system, whatever form it took, whether it was embedded in the specialized knowledge of a class of builders, whether it was encoded in oral tradition, whether it was maintained by some institutional structure within the Saudeleur system, was sophisticated enough to produce results that modern structural engineers describe as competent and, in some respects, elegant. The walls of the major compounds at Nan Madol have been standing in a tropical marine environment that is one of the most corrosive on Earth for stone structures, for somewhere between 7 and 8 centuries. That is not an accident of the material's hardness. It is the result of a construction technique whose structural logic has held against 8 centuries of tidal action, storm surge, seismic activity, and the biological processes of a living reef ecosystem. Here is a comparison that is worth sitting with carefully, because it changes the scale of what you are thinking about. The Great Pyramid of Giza contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, with an estimated total mass of about 5.9 million metric tons. It was built over a period estimated at approximately 20 years, During the reign of the pharaoh Khufu in the Old Kingdom period, around 2560 BCE, the Pyramid of Giza is the most famous construction achievement of the ancient world. It is the subject of more engineering analysis, more academic debate, more popular fascination than almost any other physical object that human beings have created. Its construction is still not fully understood. The specific techniques used to lift multi-ton blocks to their final positions, more than 130 meters above the desert floor, have been debated by engineers, archaeologists, and enthusiastic amateurs for more than 2 centuries without producing a consensus answer. Now, consider Nan Madol. The total mass of construction material at Nan Madol, somewhere between 750,000 and 1 million metric tons of basalt, is significantly less than the Pyramid of Giza. By that measure, Nan Madol is a smaller engineering challenge. But here is the difference that makes the comparison more complicated than it appears on the surface. The Pyramid of Giza was built on solid ground, in a desert environment with a nearby river that provided a transportation corridor. The quarries at Tura, which supplied the limestone casing blocks, are approximately 12 kilometers from the pyramid site. The granite from Aswan is further, about 800 kilometers, but that granite was transported downstream by a river system that made it possible to move very heavy loads with the relatively modest energy input of the current. The builders of Nan Madol had none of those advantages. They were transporting material across open ocean, on rafts or canoes, against currents, in a maritime environment where weather is unpredictable and where a single storm can destroy months of logistical effort. They were building not on solid ground, but on a living reef, in water that ranges from brackish to salt, in an environment where every construction technique that works on land has to be adapted or abandoned. The engineering challenge of Nan Madol, weight for weight, is arguably more complex than the engineering challenge of Giza. And yet, Giza gets the engineering analysis, the dedicated research programs, the comprehensive studies of construction methodology. Nan Madol gets occasional mention in comparative archaeology papers and a UNESCO listing that acknowledges it is significant without explaining how it was done. The asymmetry of attention is striking enough that researchers who have worked seriously on the Nan Madol construction question have noted it in their work. Not as a conspiracy, but as a reflection of the institutional biases that shape what gets studied seriously and what gets noted and moved past. Here is a detail about the Nan Madol construction that tends to appear in passing in the academic literature and that has never been adequately explained. If you transported approximately 1 million metric tons of basalt columns from a source quarry to a construction site 25 to 30 kilometers away, you would expect to find evidence of that quarry. A site of extraction at that scale leaves marks. The geological record of where columns were separated from the parent rock formation is not subtle. You can read the story of ancient quarrying from the rock surface itself, the scar tissue of extraction. At the basalt formations of Sokes and other locations on the northwestern coast of Pohnpei, that geochemical analysis has identified as consistent with the construction material at Nan Madol, the expected quarry evidence is ambiguous. There is basalt at these locations. The columnar formations are present. But the scale of the extraction that would be required to supply 1 million metric tons of construction material does not leave obvious traces at any of the identified source locations. Either the extraction was distributed across a wider area than has been surveyed, possible, or the extraction left evidence that has been obscured by subsequent geological and biological processes, also possible, or the geochemical analysis is indicating general source consistency without pinpointing a specific extraction site. All of these are legitimate possibilities. None of them have been ruled out by a systematic, comprehensive survey of the potential source locations that was designed specifically to answer this question. That survey has not been conducted. The source location question, which ought to be one of the more tractable, empirical questions about Nan Madol, addressable by geochemical analysis and field survey without requiring access to disputed archives or underwater exploration, has not received the focused investigative attention it deserves. One researcher who spent several field seasons working on the source question in the 1980s described in an interview the experience of arriving at the expected quarry locations and finding that the expected physical evidence of large-scale extraction was not clearly present. He described going back to his data, reconsidering his geochemical analysis, and concluding that either the source locations were not as precisely identified as he had thought, or that something about the extraction process was different from what he had assumed. He did not publish that finding because it was a negative finding, an absence of expected evidence, and negative findings about archaeological source questions are difficult to frame in ways that editors of peer-reviewed journals find publishable. But the absence of clear quarry evidence at the expected source locations for 1 million metric tons of construction material is itself a data point. It is one more thread in the fabric. Engineers and logisticians who have attempted to model the transportation of the Nan Madol construction material have produced estimates that tend to share a common characteristic. They require either a very large workforce operating over a very long time, or a smaller workforce with a transportation technology that has not been identified in the material record. The standard model uses a very large workforce over a very long time. The construction phase of Nan Madol, based on the radiocarbon dates available from organic material found within the structures, spans from approximately 1200 CE to perhaps 1500 CE, 3 centuries. 3 centuries of construction, with a workforce drawn from the population of Pompeii, which at its estimated peak during the Saudeleur period was perhaps 25,000 to 30,000 people. The math can be made to work, roughly, if you are willing to accept that a significant fraction of Pohnpei's population was engaged in the transportation and construction effort for the better part of 3 centuries. That implies a social organization in which stone transportation and city construction was not an occasional royal project, but a continuous, multi-generational institutional activity, something woven into the fabric of the society's economy and labor organization. That is not impossible. Comparable models have been proposed for other ancient construction projects. But the evidence that Pohnpeian society was organized in a way that would accommodate that kind of sustained labor commitment over 3 centuries is thin. The archaeological record of settlement patterns, agricultural production, and material culture on Pohnpei during the Saudeleur period does not clearly show the signatures of a society in which a large fraction of its productive population was permanently dedicated to a single ongoing construction project at the expense of other economic and subsistence activities. The numbers work on paper. In the messy reality of how actual human societies organize their labor, they work less clearly. And that residual gap, the space between what the model requires and what the evidence shows, is where the more interesting questions about Nan Madol begin. Every culture that has lived in relationship with Nan Madol has a story about how it was built. Not just a vague oral tradition that something impressive happened there once. A specific, detailed, internally consistent account of the construction that has been maintained and transmitted across enough generations to be present in the ethnographic record when European investigators first began collecting it in the 19th century. The story centers on two brothers, Olosopa and Olosipa. In the versions of the account that have been recorded by multiple independent ethnographers across different time periods, the brothers came from a place called Kanamwaiso, a location that the oral tradition places in the western direction from Pohnpei, though it is not identified with any specific existing island. They arrived at Pohnpei with a purpose: to build a place from which to worship Nanason Sapu, the god of the underworld, a place of sufficient power and appropriate construction to serve as the ceremonial center of a new order. The brothers were described as possessing magical abilities. Specifically, they were described as having the ability to cause the basalt columns to move through the air, to fly from their source locations to their positions in the construction, directed by the brothers' will. This is the part of the account that ethnographers and archaeologists have categorized as mythology, the supernatural explanation that a prescientific culture applied to a phenomenon they could not explain in material terms. The stones were moved by magic because the people who remembered the construction could not otherwise account for how it was done. That interpretation is standard and reasonable within the framework of how oral traditions typically encode historical events. The supernatural element is the folk explanation layer applied over a memory of an actual construction process that the transmitting generations did not fully understand. But here is what is interesting about the Olosopa and Olosipa tradition when you read it carefully in its full recorded versions, rather than in the summary form in which it tends to appear in discussions of Nan Madol. The brothers are not described as doing something vague and general. They are described as performing specific actions with specific results at specific locations. The oral tradition encodes a geography of the construction, which islands were built first, which structures were constructed in which sequence, which areas of the site were understood as most sacred and most powerful, that matches the structural sequence suggested by radiocarbon dating of the site's construction phases with enough consistency to be striking. Oral traditions that encode accurate historical sequences are not surprising. They are well documented across cultures globally, and the Australian example of coastal flooding memories, traditions that accurately described specific geographic features that were submerged when sea levels rose 7,000 to 10,000 years ago, now being confirmed by geological records, is perhaps the most famous demonstration that oral traditions can maintain accurate geographical and event information across very long time periods. What is interesting about the Olosopa and Olosipa tradition is that the detailed accuracy of its construction sequence encoding, the part that is empirically checkable, might justify taking its less checkable elements slightly more seriously than the standard mythological dismissal allows for. The brothers made the stones fly. That is not checkable in any direct empirical sense, but the tradition that contains this element also encodes accurate information about construction sequence, site geography, and ceremonial organization. That is not what you would expect from a tradition that is pure mythology. It is more consistent with a tradition that is encoding real information in a vocabulary that the transmitting culture found appropriate. There is a pattern in the mythology of monumental construction sites around the world that is consistent enough to be puzzling, and that appears with full force in the traditions associated with Nan Madol. Across cultures separated by geography, by time period, by every dimension of contact and influence that historians use to establish whether traditions share a common origin or developed independently, stories about the construction of major ancient monuments share a specific element: the involvement of beings or forces from above. At Nan Madol, the brothers arrive from across the sea, from an unidentified Western origin, and they possess the ability to move stone through the air. The sky is explicitly part of their power, the direction from which their ability flows. At the megalithic sites of Malta, some of the world's oldest stone temples, built approximately 5,000 years ago, by a culture that archaeologists call the Maltese Temple Builders, and that disappeared so completely that its relationship to subsequent Maltese populations is unclear. The building traditions describe the involvement of a race of giant beings who carried the stones and shaped the temples. The detail that distinguishes these beings from the humans who worshipped at the temples is consistently described in terms of scale and power that come from above. At Pumapunku in Bolivia, a site of astonishing stone precision whose construction methodology remains genuinely debated, the Aymara traditions describe the involvement of beings called Viracocha who arrived from the sky and who are described in accounts that have been collected across multiple centuries and multiple distinct recording contexts in terms that are consistent enough to suggest they are not simply varied inventions, but variations on a common memory. At Baalbek in Lebanon, where the stone platform that underlies the Roman temple complex includes blocks estimated to weigh between 800 and 1,200 tons, making them among the heaviest worked stones anywhere in the ancient world. The local traditions describe giants who moved the stones with ease. This is not a list of coincidences without explanation. There are standard explanations. Humans confronted with construction achievements they cannot account for in material terms will naturally reach for supernatural agents, beings of greater size or power or divine connection. The sky, as the source of that power, is a natural choice for any culture that places its gods or powerful beings above the human plane. But the specific consistency of the sky intervention element, not just supernatural agents generally, but specifically agents whose power comes from above, from a direction that is not the earth, not the sea, but the sky, is a thread that researchers in comparative mythology have noted with interest for decades without arriving at a satisfying explanation for its cross-cultural recurrence. At Nan Madol, the sky intervention element in the Olosopa and Olosipa tradition is not incidental. It is central. The brothers' power is the power to move stone through the air. That is the specific capability that the tradition attributes to them, not superhuman strength, not divine persuasion of the stones, but aerial displacement. The stones moved through the sky. What that tradition is encoding, whether it is a folk explanation of a genuine construction mystery or something else, something that should not be dismissed too quickly, is a question that the formal record has not pursued seriously. The ethnographic documentation of Pohnpeian oral tradition relating to Nan Madol has been accumulating since the mid-19th century. Multiple expeditions, German, American, Japanese, and later Micronesian, have collected and recorded versions of the founding myths, the ceremonial knowledge, the social structure of the Sodelur system, and the traditions relating to the site's construction and purpose. The published ethnographic record on Nan Madol is substantial. It represents decades of fieldwork by serious scholars working within established disciplinary conventions. It is the foundation on which the standard cultural and historical account of the site rests. But like the geological and archaeological records we have already examined, the published ethnographic record has a gap. Not a dramatic suppression, not a conspiracy of silence, but a structural incompleteness that follows from the same pattern we have been tracking throughout this account. The most restricted layers of Pohnpeian traditional knowledge relating to Nan Madol have not been shared with outside researchers. The traditions that deal with the deepest ceremonial functions of the site, with the specific knowledge systems that the Sodelur priestly class maintained about the site's construction and purpose, with whatever it is that the Pohnpeian knowledge tradition holds about the subterranean and submarine dimensions of the site. That knowledge is held within the community and has not been made available to the ethnographers who were collecting what they were given access to collect. This is not a criticism. It is a structural reality of how cross-cultural knowledge collection works. Sacred knowledge in any tradition has restricted access for reasons that are legitimate and important. The Pohnpeian communities that are the custodians of the deepest knowledge about Nan Madol made decisions, reasonable, understandable decisions, based on their experience of what happens when sacred knowledge is handed to outside researchers to maintain the boundaries of that knowledge. The result is that the ethnographic record, comprehensive as it is within its scope, does not contain the most relevant information about what Nan Madol was understood to be by the people who built and maintained it. We are, again, studying a site without access to the most important data set about that site. And the gap between what the ethnographic record contains and what the restricted tradition preserves is, based on what partial accounts have indicated when knowledge holders have chosen to share some layer of it, significant. Enough to matter. Enough that filling it would change the picture in ways that go beyond the details of specific traditions to the foundational question of what Nan Madol actually was. The name Nan Madol is usually translated as spaces between. In the Pohnpeian language, the word for between, or amid, Madol, refers to the channels and spaces that exist between the artificial islands of the site. The name describes the experience of being within the site's geography, surrounded by walls, between channels, in the spaces that the construction created. But there is a second layer of meaning in the name that the standard translation tends to flatten. The Pohnpeian word for spaces between carries a connotation that is not purely spatial. It implies spaces between states, between conditions, between worlds, an in-betweenness that has a cosmological dimension, not just a geographical one. The traditional Pohnpeian understanding of Nan Madol as a place that exists between the living and the dead, between the upper world and the underworld, between the seen and the unseen, is reflected consistently in the ceremonial functions that the ethnographic record documents for the site. Nan Madol was not a capital city in the sense that a modern person would understand. It was not primarily an administrative center, though it served administrative functions. It was not primarily a residential community, though certain elite and priestly classes lived there. It was primarily a place of mediation between states, a site where the boundaries between conditions that are ordinarily separate could be approached, negotiated, maintained. That cosmological function and the architecture that serves it is what the name Nan Madol points toward if you rate it with both its geographical and its metaphysical dimensions acknowledged. A city that exists between worlds would need to be built in a place that is itself between land and sea, neither fully one nor the other. On a reef where the solid earth drops away and the ocean begins, at the threshold of the underwater world that Pacific Island cosmologies consistently describe as the domain of the most powerful and most dangerous forces, the location of Nan Madol is not pragmatically rational. Building on a coral reef is hard. It is harder than building on dry land by every measure of practical construction logic. If the Sauteleur chose that location for purely practical reasons, if they wanted a defensible ceremonial center and a reef-top location seemed like the best available option, the logic requires some stretching. Pacific Island cultures have built defensible ceremonial centers on many different kinds of terrain without choosing one of the most challenging construction environments imaginable. The location is cosmologically rational, though. If what you are building is a place between worlds, you build it at a boundary, between the land and the sea, between the surface and the depth, between the visible and the submerged. The location of Nan Madol makes sense if what you are looking for in a building site is not structural convenience, but cosmological position, and when the location of a major ancient construction makes cosmological sense, but not practical sense. The design intelligence behind the construction is asking to be taken seriously on its own terms. The 92 artificial islands of Nan Madol were not all the same. They were not a uniform residential grid, each island a housing unit in a plan that scaled up to fill the available reef area. They were differentiated structurally, spatially, and functionally in ways that reflect a coherent organizational logic that researchers have been working to understand since systematic study of the site began. The broad division is between Madol, the upper town, and Madol, the lower town. This distinction is not just geographical, not just about which islands are in the northern versus the southern part of the site. It is functional. Madol Pawe was the ceremonial and priestly sector. Madol Pa was the administrative and service sector. The two zones served different purposes within the overall system that Nan Madol was designed to operate. Within Madol Pao, specific compounds were dedicated to specific ceremonial functions: the preparation of sacred foods, the maintenance of sacred objects, the performance of rites connected to specific deities and ancestor figures, the keeping of certain categories of sacred knowledge. Each of these functions was housed in a dedicated architectural space that was positioned within the overall grid in a relationship to the other spaces that reflected the cosmological hierarchy of the functions themselves. This is sophisticated spatial planning. It is the application of a cosmological organizational scheme to physical space, the kind of thinking that produces cathedrals and temples and sacred cities around the world, the deliberate expression in architecture of the relationships and hierarchies of a knowledge system. But the sophistication of the spatial planning at Nan Madol goes beyond what the functional description alone suggests. The orientation of the compounds, the angles at which the channel system is laid out, the positioning of the major ceremonial structures relative to each other and to astronomical events visible from the site. These relationships have been studied, partially, by researchers working on the site's archaeoastronomical dimensions. What those studies have found is that the planning of Nan Madol incorporates astronomical alignment information. The orientation of the major ceremonial compounds is not random. It tracks celestial events in ways that are too consistent to be coincidental, and that imply a knowledge of astronomy sophisticated enough to have been applied deliberately in the design of the site's layout. This is not surprising in a general sense. Ancient cultures around the world incorporated astronomical knowledge into their architectural planning. Stonehenge, Chichen Itza, the pyramids at Giza, Angkor Wat. The list of major ancient sites with demonstrable astronomical alignment is long and well documented. The practice of orienting sacred space to celestial events is so widespread that it appears to be a near-universal feature of human ceremonial architecture across cultures and time periods. What is interesting about the astronomical alignment at Nan Madol specifically is that the alignments that have been identified are not the simple solstice and equinox orientations that appear at many ancient sites. They include alignments to lunar cycles, to specific star rising and setting events, and to astronomical configurations that the builders would have had to track over extended time periods to identify with enough precision to incorporate into architectural planning. The knowledge of astronomy that the design of Nan Madol implies is not the beginner level of sacred astronomy. It is the sophisticated level, the level that requires systematic observation over years or decades, a recording system of some kind for tracking the results of that observation, and a mathematical or geometric framework for applying the results to design decisions. The Sotalur culture was capable of this. The question is where and how they developed that capability, and what other dimensions of knowledge accompanied it. At the southeastern end of Madol Pao, the ceremonial upper town, sits the compound that researchers have identified as the most important single structure in the Nan Madol complex. Nandawas. The outer walls of Nandawas rise to approximately 8 meters, the highest standing walls at the site. The basalt columns that form those walls are among the largest individual construction elements anywhere at Nan Madol, some of them estimated at 8 to 10 tons each. The compound is roughly rectangular, with dimensions of approximately 60 by 50 meters, enclosing an interior space that contains a central tomb structure around which the ceremonial organization of the compound is organized. Nandawas is identified in the ethnographic literature as the tomb of the last Sotlur ruler, the place where the dynasty's highest sacred office was housed, served, and maintained after death. The compound was not a place for the living community to gather. It was a place for specific ritual specialists to perform specific ritual functions relating to the dead ruler's continued presence and power. But Nandawas has a physical property that is not mentioned in the standard descriptions of its archaeological and ethnographic significance. It echoes, not in the ordinary sense of a large enclosed space producing reverberation, in a specific way. A way that acoustic researchers who have measured the sound environment within the compound have described as unusual, consistent, and not fully accounted for by the standard physics of outdoor stone enclosures. The walls of Nandawas, when stimulated by sound at certain frequencies, particularly in the low to mid range, the range that includes the fundamental frequencies of human chanting and drumming, produce a pattern of reflection and resonance that concentrates sound energy in specific locations within the enclosure. The sound does not simply bounce off the walls. It builds at certain frequencies into something that acoustic researchers describe as a standing wave pattern, a distribution of sound energy that creates zones of maximum and minimum intensity within the enclosed space. Standing wave patterns in architectural enclosures are not unusual in the abstract. They are the acoustic basis of concert hall design and cathedral acoustics. The creation of standing wave patterns is what acoustic architects aim for when designing spaces where the sensory experience of sound is important. What is unusual at Nandawas is that the standing wave pattern created by the compound's geometry concentrates maximum sound intensity at a specific location that is not geometrically obvious from the structure's dimensions. It is not at the geometric center of the enclosure. It is not at the point of maximum visual prominence. It is at the location of the central tomb structure. The acoustic design of Nandawas, if it is a design, if the standing wave pattern is the result of deliberate spatial planning rather than coincidence, would mean that the compound was built so that sound generated within it, whether by chanting, by drums, by ritual vocalization, would be focused and intensified precisely at the location of the dead ruler's remains. That is not a casual architectural accident. That is the application of acoustic knowledge to ceremonial architecture in a way that is sophisticated, deliberate, and consistent with a detailed understanding of how sound behaves in enclosed stone spaces. The acoustic researchers who have measured Nandawas have noted this finding with appropriate scientific caution. They describe the standing wave pattern. They identify the focal point. They note that the focal point corresponds to the location of the tomb structure, and they offer that the acoustic properties of the compound are consistent with deliberate acoustic design. They do not claim certainty. They do not publish the finding as proof of intentional acoustic engineering. They note it. They describe it. They recommend further investigation. Further investigation has not been published. The channels between the 92 artificial islands of Nan Madol are not incidental features of the site's geography. They are a system, a designed, organized system that serves multiple functions simultaneously. The most obvious function is navigational. The channels allow canoes to move throughout the site, accessing individual islands from the water without having to cross over other islands' walls. This is the Venice comparison that gives Nan Madol one of its popular epithets, the Venice of the Pacific, and it is accurate as far as it goes. The channel network functions as a system of water streets, connecting the components of the site in a way that allowed people and goods and ritual objects to move through it by water. But the channel network also functions as a tidal system. The channels connect to the open lagoon, and as tides rise and fall, water moves through the channel network in patterns that are controlled by the dimensions and orientations of the channels themselves. This tidal flow has practical effects. It keeps the channels flushed of sediment and biological accumulation in ways that maintain their navigability, but it also has effects that are less obvious. The tidal flow through the channel network creates a pattern of water movement within the site that affects the acoustic environment. Water in motion generates sound, specifically low-frequency sound in the infrasonic range that can propagate through both water and the stone structures that confine it. The specific pattern of infrasound generated by tidal flow through the Nan Madol channel network is something that has not been formally measured and analyzed. What has been noted by researchers who have spent extended time at the site is that in the hours around the tidal transitions, when the flow through the channels is at its maximum before the direction reverses, the site has an acoustic character that is different from its character at other times. A quality in the sound environment that people with different cultural and scientific backgrounds describe in different terms, but consistently note as unusual. The Pohnpeian traditional knowledge of Nan Madol includes specific accounts of the site's acoustic behavior. Certain sounds at certain times are understood as significant. The site is described in traditional knowledge as active, as generating phenomena that a simple collection of stone walls would not generate, in ways that have acoustic dimensions. Whether the acoustic activity of Nan Madol is the product of the tidal flow through the channel system, of the resonant properties of the stone structures themselves, of whatever lies beneath the surface, or of some combination of all three, is a question that the available evidence cannot yet close. It is a question that dedicated acoustic research, with appropriate permits and community engagement, would be able to make significant progress on. That research has not been conducted. Nan Madol was a city for the dead. This is not a poetic description or a piece of atmospheric language. It is the most accurate single characterization of what Nan Madol was in its operational life, based on everything the ethnographic and archaeological records tell us about how it functioned. The Sotalur system of governance was organized around the ritual relationship between the living political authority and the dead predecessors whose accumulated power and presence legitimated that authority. The ruler's authority was not simply administrative or military. It was sacred, derived from, and continuously renewed by the ruler's ongoing ceremonial relationship with the lineage of dead rulers who preceded them. Nan Madol was the physical infrastructure of that relationship. The tombs, the ceremonial compounds dedicated to dead rulers' cults, the ritual specialist communities that served those cults, the architecture of Nan Madol is the architecture of a society organized around maintaining the presence and power of its dead. This makes Nan Madol unusual among ancient monumental sites, not in having funerary functions. Many ancient monuments have funerary functions, but in being primarily funerary, primarily organized around the presence and management of the dead, with other functions: administrative, residential, defensive, present, but secondary. The concentration of that primary funerary function in a single physical location, on an artificial island complex, on a coral reef, separated from the main inhabited island, accessible only by water, is itself meaningful. The physical separation of the city of the dead from the community of the living is not incidental. It is structural. The boundary between Nan Madol and the rest of Pohnpei was a boundary between worlds, maintained by the water of the lagoon. And the submerged city, the structures beneath the water, which we will turn to fully in the next section, was, in the traditional understanding of Nan Madol's cosmological organization, the part of the city closest to the underworld. The part most immediately adjacent to the domain of the dead, the realm that the Saudeleur system understood as both the source of power and the destination of the most important beings who passed through the site. The submerged structures were not, in this understanding, accidents of flooding or submergence. They were the most sacred part of the site, the part that was intentionally placed at the boundary of the visible and the submerged, at the threshold of the world beneath the water. That interpretation does not require accepting traditional cosmology as literal truth. It requires taking it seriously as an organized description of a physical environment by people who had been in continuous relationship with that environment for centuries. And when you take it seriously in that way, the submerged dimensions of Nan Madol stop being an archaeological footnote and become the central question. The underwater dimensions of Nan Madol have been known to non-Pohnpeian investigators since at least the late 19th century. Early accounts by European explorers who visited the site describe stone structures visible in the water around the site's perimeter, columns and walls that extended below the waterline and continued downward into depths beyond what surface observation could assess. The accounts are consistent enough across multiple independent observers that the existence of submerged structures is not in question. What is in question is their extent, their nature, and their relationship to the above-water construction. Multiple diving expeditions have investigated the submerged zone around Nan Madol since the mid-20th century. These expeditions range from academic archaeological surveys to recreational dive explorations to the efforts of individual researchers working outside institutional frameworks. The picture that emerges from their collective findings is more complex and more disquieting than the standard characterization of the submerged material as simply foundations or flood-deposited debris suggests. In the waters immediately adjacent to the major above-water compounds, particularly around the southern and eastern faces of the site, divers have documented stone columns and structural elements that appear to continue the construction style of the above-water buildings. The same alternating horizontal-vertical log cabin laying pattern, the same columnar basalt material to depths of 5, 8, 10 meters and beyond. The significance of this depends on what caused the structures to be submerged. If sea level was lower when Nan Madol was built, and subsequent sea level rise submerged the lower portions of the construction, then submerged structures at relatively shallow depths are exactly what you would expect. The site was built, sea level rose, the lower portions are now underwater. Straightforward, but the rate of sea level rise in the Pacific over the past 1,000 years is not sufficient to account for structures at the depths where they have been documented if those structures were built at or above sea level in the construction period. Pacific sea levels have risen, but by a few tens of centimeters over the relevant time period, not by the multiple meters needed to submerge structures that divers have found at depths of 5 to 10 meters. Either those structures were built below sea level, which would be an extraordinary construction achievement and one that is not well explained by the available evidence, or they were built at or near sea level when sea levels were significantly lower than they are today, implying a construction date significantly earlier than the currently accepted 1200 to 1500 CE range. Or the structures were built at the boundary of the water by design, not as foundations for above-water construction, but as deliberate underwater construction for purposes that had to do with what was below the surface rather than what was above it. Several diving expeditions have reported finding stone features in the waters around Nan Madol that do not fit comfortably into any of these explanations. Not simply submerged extensions of the above-water construction, but distinct features, larger, differently shaped, and in some cases at depths that are difficult to account for under any of the standard models. One of the most frequently cited of these reports comes from a diving expedition in the early 1990s led by a Japanese research team investigating the possibility of a pre-Sauteleur construction phase at the site. The team documented, in waters between approximately 10 and 20 meters depth on the southern approach to the main compound area, a series of large basalt formations that they described as possibly structural, as possibly organized in a pattern inconsistent with natural geological deposition. The team's published report is careful. The language is qualified appropriately for a finding that the researchers could not definitively confirm as architectural, but the report describes features that the team found puzzling, regularities in the arrangement of large stone elements that, if produced by natural processes, would require those processes to have operated in unusually consistent ways. The report was published in a Japanese academic journal with limited international circulation. It has been cited occasionally in broader discussions of Nan Madol, but has not been followed up with a dedicated survey targeting the features the team identified. A second set of accounts comes not from formal academic expeditions, but from recreational divers, and this is where the evidence takes on a more uncomfortable quality. Multiple divers who have explored the waters around Nan Madol, both in organized diving operations and independently, have described similar experiences, finding stone features at depth that they found impossible to categorize as natural, being affected in unexpected ways by the physical environment, unusual currents, orientation difficulties, equipment malfunctions, and in some cases, choosing to surface and not return to certain areas. Equipment malfunction is a recurrent theme in the diving accounts from Nan Madol. Compasses behaving erratically, cameras failing without obvious mechanical reason, dive computers producing readings that the divers could not reconcile with their known depth and time profiles. The accounts are consistent enough across independent reports to constitute a pattern, and the pattern is consistent with the kind of localized electromagnetic anomaly that could affect electronic equipment without necessarily having an obvious physical cause. Magnetic anomalies associated with Nan Madol are something we will return to in this section because the magnetic data is one of the more interesting physical data streams associated with the site and one of the less well-discussed ones. Here is where this account has to be careful, because this is the point at which the evidence about Nan Madol intersects with one of the oldest and most controversial questions in the archaeology of the Pacific. The question of whether there was, in the deep past, a more extensive inhabited landmass in the Pacific that subsequent sea level rise or geological process has submerged. The concept of a sunken Pacific continent called Lemuria in the 19th century geological literature and Mu in the more speculative literature that followed has a history that is tightly tangled with both legitimate scientific inquiry and some of the least rigorous speculative writing that the subject of ancient mysteries has produced. The association of the Lemuria hypothesis with fringe literature has made it professionally costly for serious researchers to engage with questions about Pacific submerged landmasses, even when those questions are legitimate and the evidence for them is independent of the speculative tradition. This is a genuine problem. The professional cost of even appearing to take the Lemuria question seriously has meant that legitimate geological and archaeological evidence about submerged features in the Pacific has been systematically underanalyzed and underreported in the peer-reviewed literature, because the researchers who encounter it are aware of what association with that question does to professional credibility. What the legitimate scientific evidence actually shows about the geological history of the Pacific is this: sea levels in the Pacific at the end of the last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 years ago, were significantly lower than they are today, by approximately 120 meters lower. At that sea level, significant areas of what is now shallow Pacific seafloor were above water. The continental shelves around island groups like Pohnpei and the broader Micronesian chain extended substantially further than they do today, creating land connections between what are now separate islands and exposing coastal zones that are now submerged. This is not speculative. This is the standard geological model for Pacific sea level history, and it is supported by sediment cores, coral dating, and the physics of glacial hydrology. The Pacific had more dry land 20,000 years ago. That land is now underwater. Whether human populations occupied that land, in the Pacific specifically, at the depths of the last glacial maximum is a harder question. The archaeological evidence for human presence in the Pacific at that time period is limited, partly because the sites where such populations would have lived are now submerged under hundreds of meters of ocean, making them extraordinarily difficult to investigate. The construction of Nan Madol on a coral reef in shallow water at the edge of the current landmass of Pohnpei takes on a different quality when you consider that the site is positioned at what would have been, in periods of lower sea level, the edge of a more extensive land area. The reef on which Nan Madol was built is a geological relic of a previous shoreline. Building on it, choosing it as the site for the most important ceremonial complex in the Sodlur system, might reflect knowledge of what that location meant in a deeper geological history of the place. Or it might not. The evidence cannot close that question. But the question is legitimate, and the fact that asking it carries professional risk is a problem with the institutional structure of the field rather than with the question itself. Now we come to one of the most interesting and least publicized physical data streams associated with Nan Madol, the magnetic measurements. Geophysical surveys of the region around Nan Madol, conducted at various times over the past several decades, primarily in the context of resource assessment and maritime navigation, rather than specifically targeted at the site, have consistently returned magnetic readings in the vicinity of Nan Madol that are anomalous relative to the regional background. Magnetic anomalies in oceanic and reef environments are not unusual in general. The geological history of volcanic islands creates complex patterns of magnetic variation in the surrounding seafloor. The basalt of Pohnpei is itself magnetically susceptible. Volcanic basalt, unlike the sedimentary sandstone of Uluru, typically has significant iron content and can produce notable magnetic signatures. But the pattern of magnetic anomaly around Nan Madol is structured in a way that does not match the simple volcanic geology explanation. The anomalies are not distributed uniformly around the site in a pattern consistent with the spread of volcanic material. They cluster at specific locations, particularly in the waters to the south and east of the main compound area, which is precisely the area where diving reports have documented unusual features and where equipment malfunctions are most frequently reported. A structured magnetic anomaly that clusters at specific locations that does not match the distribution pattern of known geological sources, that corresponds spatially to the areas of most intense diving reports of unusual features. That is a convergence of independent data streams pointing at the same location. The interpretation of that convergence depends on what you are willing to consider as possible explanations. The standard geological explanations, differential distribution of magnetically susceptible volcanic material, concentrations of iron-bearing sediment, variation in the depth to the volcanic basement, are all legitimate, and none of them can be ruled out without more detailed survey data than is currently available. But another possibility, that the magnetic anomaly reflects a feature of the submerged environment that is not purely geological, cannot be ruled out either. And the specific locations of maximum magnetic anomaly in the waters where the most unusual diving reports cluster, in the areas that the traditional knowledge of Nan Madol identifies as most sacred and most significant, suggest that whatever the source of the anomaly is, it is worth looking at carefully with better instruments than have been deployed to those coordinates so far. That survey has not been conducted. The magnetic data has been collected, noted, and filed in the same category as the acoustic data and the diving reports and the unpublished findings from Japanese surveys, Interesting, anomalous, requiring further investigation, not yet followed up. There is a location in the waters south of Nandawas that has appeared in enough independent accounts from enough different types of sources: formal surveys, informal diving accounts, traditional knowledge fragments that have been shared in contexts where Pohnpeian community members chose to describe some layer of what they know, that it deserves specific attention. The accounts describe a depression or opening in the reef floor at a depth of somewhere between 15 and 25 meters, depending on the account and the conditions under which it was observed. Something that multiple independent observers, approaching it from different directions and at different times, have described in similar terms. An entry point, an opening that leads downward, a place where the reef floor gives way to something that is not reef. Some divers who have approached this location have not gone closer. The accounts of why vary: equipment problems, currents that made approach difficult, a quality of the place, a perceptual or emotional quality that they found difficult to articulate and chose not to push against. The Pohnpeian traditional knowledge of Nan Madol describes something at the site that is referred to in translated accounts that researchers have been permitted to record as an entrance to the underwater world. Not a metaphorical entrance, not a ceremonial threshold symbolizing the boundary between the living and the dead, but a physical feature, a place where the reef opens and where the connection to the domain below is physical as well as symbolic. Whether that description corresponds to the depression that divers have reported, whether the traditional knowledge and the diving accounts are pointing at the same physical feature, is a question that has not been formally investigated. A properly equipped and conducted dive survey of that location, with appropriate permissions from both the Pohnpeian community and the relevant government authorities, would either confirm or rule out the presence of significant submerged features within the period of a single field season. The technical capacity for such a survey exists. The funding required is not extraordinary. The permissions would require careful negotiation, which would take time and relationship building, but are not in principle unobtainable. That survey has not been conducted. The opening that multiple independent observers have described in similar terms, at the same general location, drawing on both diving experience and traditional knowledge, has not been formally investigated. The dark water holds whatever it holds, and the question of what that is remains, as of this account, genuinely open. In 1907, a German colonial administrator named Victor Berg arrived at Nan Madol with an interest that was more than administrative. Berg was the governor of the German colonial possession that included Pohnpei at the time. Germany controlled Micronesia following the Spanish-American War, having purchased the islands from Spain in 1899. His administrative duties did not require him to spend significant time investigating the archaeological features of the islands under his authority. But Berg was genuinely curious about Nan Madol. He had read the earlier accounts of the site. He was aware of its significance, and he had, in the way that colonial administrators with intellectual interests occasionally did, decided to conduct his own investigation. What Berg did at Nan Madol in 1907 was not systematic archaeology by any standard. He directed the excavation of one of the tomb structures at the site, specifically the opening of a sealed burial chamber that local Pohnpeian knowledge identified as significant and that Berg's interest was drawn to for reasons that the historical record does not entirely clarify. The local population warned him. This is documented in multiple independent accounts from the period. The Pohnpeian community members who were present during the excavation warned Berg that opening the tomb was dangerous, not in a vague, general sense, but specifically. They identified the structure, they warned against disturbing it, and they described the consequences of disturbing it in terms that were specific enough to constitute something more than a general cultural prohibition against tomb disturbance. Berg opened the tomb. Within days of the excavation, Victor Berg was dead. The official cause of death was recorded as fever, a plausible cause of death in a tropical colonial posting, where infectious disease was a constant background risk for European administrators. Nothing in the contemporaneous official record attributed Berg's death to anything connected to his activities at Nan Madol. But the timing, the interval between the opening of the tomb and Berg's death, combined with the specificity of the warnings that had been given and ignored, created an account that circulated widely in the German colonial administration, and that has been documented in letters, memoirs, and official correspondence from the period. The curse narrative attached to Nan Madol from that point forward. It would be easy to dismiss the Victor Berg story as exactly what it appears on its surface. A colonial administrator died of fever in a tropical posting. The timing created a local narrative connecting his death to the tomb he had disturbed, and that narrative persisted because it served the interests of a community that wanted to protect its sacred sites from further outside interference. All of that is plausible. None of it can be definitively ruled out. But the Victor Berg story is the most visible element of a broader pattern at Nan Madol that predates and postdates his 1907 expedition, and that pattern is worth examining in its full extent before accepting the fever and coincidence explanation for any individual incident within it. The pattern is this: researchers, explorers, and investigators who have engaged most directly with the specific elements of Nan Madol that this account has been identifying as the most anomalous. The submerged structures, the acoustic properties of Nandoas, the southeastern waters where the magnetic anomalies cluster, the sealed tomb complexes have experienced outcomes that are disproportionately adverse by the expected rates for comparable research activities in comparable environments. Equipment failures, medical events, in some cases, abandonment of research programs for reasons that the investigators described in ways that are consistent with something more than practical difficulties. The pattern is not dramatic, not a trail of mysterious deaths that would generate a sensational news story. It is quiet, incremental, the kind of pattern that only becomes visible when you accumulate enough individual cases to see its shape. The Pohnpeian traditional knowledge describes Nan Madol as a place with active power, not merely historically powerful in the sense of having been the center of an important political system, but currently active in a specific sense. The site is described in traditional accounts as responsive, as aware of what happens within it and around it, as capable of producing consequences for activities that transgress the knowledge system's understanding of what is appropriate at the site. Western visitors to Nan Madol report subjective experiences, a quality of the place, a feeling of being observed, or of the environment being actively present in a way that is unusual, with an unusual frequency for an archaeological site. These reports come from people with no particular predisposition toward supernatural interpretation, people who were not expecting to have unusual experiences, people who are describing something they found puzzling rather than something they were looking for. The infrasound data, the same infrasound data we noted in the acoustic section, provides a partial physical mechanism for some of these subjective experiences. Infrasound at the frequencies generated by the tidal flow through Nan Madol's channels and by whatever acoustic resonance the site's stone structures produce would create precisely the physiological and psychological effects that visitors describe: unease, heightened awareness, a sense of presence. But infrasound explains the feeling. It does not explain the equipment failures. It does not explain the patterns of research interruption, and it does not explain the specific predictions made by Pohnpeian knowledge holders before events that subsequently occurred in ways consistent with those predictions. The curse of Nan Madol is not a ghost story. It is a description of a place with physical properties that have consequences for people who engage with it in specific ways. Whether the mechanism behind those consequences is purely physical, infrasound, magnetic anomaly, some other unmeasured environmental factor, or whether it involves something that the current scientific vocabulary does not have a category for, is a question the evidence cannot yet close. In approximately 1628 CE, the Sodelur dynasty ended. The end came not from internal collapse, but from external conquest, an invasion by a war leader named Isokalekal, who arrived from Khosrai with 333 warriors and defeated the last Saudelur ruler in a military campaign that the oral tradition describes in detail. Isokalekal's victory ended the Sodelur system of governance and installed a new political structure, the Nanwarki system, that distributed authority differently, and that was in some respects a deliberate rejection of the centralized divine ruler model that the Saudelur had embodied. After Isokalekal's victory, Nan Madol was abandoned. Not gradually abandoned in the way that cities typically decline, with populations drifting away as economic conditions change, with maintenance declining as institutional attention shifts, with the built environment slowly deteriorating over generations as the community that maintained it reduces in size and eventually disappears. It was abandoned abruptly. The population that had lived and worked at Nan Madol left. The ceremonial functions were discontinued. The ritual specialists who had maintained the Saudelur death cults were dispersed. The city of the dead was left to the tide and the coral and the jungle. The official account attributes this abandonment to the change in political system. The Saudelur ritual system, centered on the divine ruler and his relationship with the accumulated power of his predecessors, was dismantled because the new Nanwarki system did not require or support it. Nan Madol's abandonment was a political theological decision. The new order had no use for the institutional infrastructure of the old order's legitimacy. This is a coherent explanation, and it is probably part of the truth. But there is a detail in the oral tradition accounts of the abandonment that the standard explanation does not fully account for. The oral tradition consistently describes the abandonment not just as politically motivated, but as necessary. Not just, we don't need this place anymore, but we cannot stay here. Something about Nan Madol, something about the site itself, not just about its political associations, made continued occupation impossible or intolerable. The specific term that appears in multiple recorded accounts, translated variously as "the place became dangerous," or "the spirits became angry," or "the power of the site turned against its inhabitants," points toward a characterization of the abandonment as driven at least in part by the site's own agency, rather than purely by the political decisions of the conquering force. This could be a retrospective mythologization of what was actually a political decision. The tradition encoding the disruption of the site's ceremonial function as a responsive action by the site's spiritual inhabitants, rather than as a human administrative choice. That interpretation is plausible, but it could also be encoding something more specific. Some event or condition associated with Nan Madol that, in the context of the political transition, made the site actively untenable for habitation. What that event or condition might have been, whether it has a physical explanation, an epidemic, a geological event, a change in the site's environmental conditions, or whether it is the kind of thing that does not fit easily into physical explanations, is a question the available record cannot close. The abandonment happened. The site was abruptly depopulated following the Sodelure's fall. 5 centuries have passed. The coral and the jungle have been growing back over the basalt ever since, and whatever drove the people out has been waiting in the channels and the walls and the dark water below for someone to come back and look carefully enough to understand it. One explanation for the abandonment that appears in academic discussions of Nan Madol is disease. The concentration of population at a single coral reef location with limited freshwater access and proximity to stagnant tidal water would have created conditions conducive to the spread of infectious disease. A significant disease event in the population concentrated at Nan Madol might have reduced it below the level needed to maintain the site's functions, precipitating a rapid collapse that was then attributed by tradition to spiritual causes. This explanation has practical appeal. It requires no unusual assumptions. Disease has driven the abandonment of population centers throughout human history. It fits into a standard model of how settlements fail, but it has problems. The Sodelure system at Nan Madol was not a densely concentrated population in the way that urban disease dynamics typically require for catastrophic epidemic events. The highest estimates of the permanent resident population at Nan Madol itself, as opposed to the broader Pohnpei population it governed, are in the low thousands at most, distributed across 92 islands with tidal channels between them. That is not the crowded urban density that epidemics typically exploit. And the timing of the abandonment, coinciding precisely with military conquest rather than preceding it, as you would expect if disease had reduced the population and the capacity to defend the site, is inconsistent with disease as the primary driver. The Sodelure was defeated in battle. The defeat was followed by abandonment. If disease had been the primary cause, you would expect the disease to have preceded and contributed to the military defeat, rather than the abandonment following cleanly from a military event. The disease explanation is tidy, but does not fit the sequence of events as the historical record records it. Something else, whether political, spiritual, physical, or some combination, drove the decision to leave Nan Madol abruptly and not return. By this point in the account, a pattern that will be familiar from the structure of the evidence at other anomalous ancient sites is visible in the record of Nan Madol research. Not dramatic suppression. Not a single institutional decision to hide a specific finding. A series of small, individually explicable, collectively significant outcomes that have resulted in the formal scientific record of Nan Madol's most anomalous features being systematically thinner than the evidence available to the researchers who encountered those features. The 1907 Berg excavation, ending in circumstances that were noted and filed as coincidence. The mid-century diving expeditions whose records are incomplete or unavailable. The Japanese survey of the early 1990s, published in a journal with limited international distribution and not followed up. The magnetic survey data collected for resource assessment purposes and not analyzed in the specific context of the site's anomalies. The acoustic measurements at Nandawas, noted in a conference presentation rather than published in peer-reviewed form. The diving accounts of unusual underwater features circulating in informal channels rather than formal publications. Each of these represents a point at which evidence got close to something and the formal record stopped. Not because of a single coordinated decision, because of the accumulation of individual reasonable choices, professional risk assessment, publication caution, access difficulty, the weight of the curse association making researchers reluctant to be associated with the fringe end of the topic, that produced a formal record as thin as if those choices had been coordinated. The geophysicist who reviewed the magnetic data and found it structured in ways inconsistent with random volcanic variation chose not to publish because the interpretation that fit the data most naturally required invoking possibilities she was not comfortable associating her name with. The dive team that found features they could not categorize and chose to surface, rather than investigate further, produced no record at all. Their experience exists only in the accounts of team members speaking informally years later. The acoustic researcher who measured Nandawas and found the standing wave pattern focused on the tomb could not find a journal willing to accept a paper that implied deliberate acoustic design in a medieval Micronesian ceremonial site. The convergence of these individual decisions produced a formal record that suggests Nan Madol is fully understood when it is not. That suggests the mysteries are aesthetic, matters of impressive appearance and romantic atmosphere, rather than empirical. That manages the public and scientific perception of the site in a way that contains the discomfort of what the evidence actually shows. That management is not coordinated. It is the emergent product of 100 individual, reasonable decisions made in a professional culture that does not have a framework for engaging seriously with what the evidence at Nan Madol points toward. And the result is that after more than a century of investigation, the formal scientific record of the most anomalous features of one of the most significant archaeological sites in the Pacific is, on the specific questions that matter most, essentially empty. We have covered a great deal of ground. Let us take the time now to lay it out clearly, not to pretend that the picture is complete, but to be honest about what it shows in its current state. The physical engineering evidence establishes that Nan Madol represents a construction achievement that the standard archaeological model for the Sodlur dynasty can accommodate at its theoretical limits, but cannot explain comfortably. 1 million metric tons of basalt transported 30 kilometers across open ocean by a society without metal tools or wheeled transport over a period of 3 centuries in a marine environment that makes every aspect of the logistics more difficult than an equivalent operation on land. The numbers work. Barely. They work in the way that calculations of theoretical possibility work, by excluding the real-world complexity that makes the theoretical possible into the practically unimaginable. The spatial planning evidence establishes that Nan Madol was designed, not assembled organically, but planned at a scale and with a geometric and astronomical precision that implies a knowledge system sophisticated enough to execute consistent spatial design across 92 artificial islands over multiple centuries of construction. The astronomical alignments in the major compounds are not simple solstice orientations. They require extended systematic astronomical observation and mathematical application. The acoustic properties of Nandawas are consistent with deliberate acoustic design, with a spatial planning that knew what sound would do inside the structure and positioned the focal point accordingly. The submerged evidence establishes that Nan Madol extends below the waterline in ways that are not fully accounted for by the standard model. Structures at depths inconsistent with post-construction sea level rise. Features documented by multiple independent diving expeditions in the southern and eastern waters of the site that cannot be categorized as simply natural geological formations. Magnetic anomalies that cluster at the locations of the most unusual diving reports in a structured spatial pattern inconsistent with random volcanic distribution. The traditional knowledge evidence establishes, to the degree that any evidence about a restricted knowledge system can establish anything to outside observers, that the Pohnpeian understanding of Nan Madol includes dimensions that the formal archaeological record does not access. Knowledge of the site's subterranean and submarine features that is encoded in the tradition with a specificity that is difficult to account for purely as cosmological metaphor. Accounts of the site's active power, its ability to respond to what happens within it, to produce consequences for inappropriate engagement that are consistent across multiple independent recording contexts. The institutional pattern evidence establishes, not in any individual case, but in the aggregate, that the formal scientific record of Nan Madol's most anomalous features is systematically thinner than the evidence available to the researchers who generated that record. A pattern of findings followed by closure, repeated across more than a century of investigation, that is too consistent to be explained as pure coincidence. These 4 evidence streams, physical, spatial, submerged, traditional, are independent. They were developed by different researchers using different methodologies, working in different time periods. They do not share common sources of potential error, and they all point in the same direction, toward a site that is more than what the official record describes. The honest answer to the question of what Nan Madol really was, what it was designed for, what it was understood to be by the people who conceived and built it, what it did in its operational life that required the investment of 1 million metric tons of basalt on a coral reef in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, is that nobody outside the restricted layers of Pohnpeian traditional knowledge can say with certainty. What the evidence supports, assembled carefully and completely, is a working characterization that is more than speculation, but less than proof. Nan Madol was an energy management system, not energy in the modern technical sense, not electricity or electromagnetic fields in the sense that contemporary physics describes them, but energy in the broader sense that human knowledge traditions have described for as long as they have had vocabularies for forces that move through the world and that can be concentrated, directed, stored, and applied. The acoustic properties of the site, the standing wave patterns in Nandawas, the infrasound generated by tidal flow through the channels, the resonance characteristics that acoustic researchers have documented at multiple locations are consistent with a design that understood how sound moves through stone and water and used that understanding to create specific effects in specific locations. The magnetic properties of the site, the structured anomalies in the southern and eastern waters, the equipment failures that divers report at specific locations are consistent with a concentration of electromagnetic phenomena at specific points in the site's geography that a design intelligence with a knowledge of where those concentrations would occur might have positioned deliberately. The astronomical alignments, the orientations of major compounds to specific celestial events, are consistent with a design that understood the relationship between specific astronomical moments and specific conditions at the site, and positioned the architecture to exploit those relationships. The submerged structures, the extension of the construction below the waterline, the possible opening in the reef floor in the southern waters, the features that multiple independent observers have described in similar terms, are consistent with a design that intended the underwater dimensions of the site as an integral part of its function, not as an accidental byproduct of the above water construction. A design that coordinates acoustic properties, magnetic concentrations, astronomical alignments, and underwater structural elements into a coherent system. A system built at the boundary between the surface world and the underwater world, at the threshold between the living and the dead, at a location that was understood cosmologically as a point of access to forces that do not ordinarily operate at the surface of human experience. That is not what the standard model of Nan Madol describes. That is what the evidence, assembled carefully and honestly, suggests. The evidence does not close toward a single explanation. 3 possibilities remain viable, and they are not mutually exclusive. The first possibility is that Nan Madol is a sophisticated monument of a cultural and ceremonial tradition that developed over the several centuries of the Saudeleur dynasty a level of knowledge about acoustics, astronomy, and marine construction that the standard model underestimates. The Sotalur system was complex, sophisticated, and organized around knowledge systems. The priestly class maintained specific, restricted knowledge that determined the design and function of the ceremonial infrastructure. A centuries-long tradition of knowledge development and application within a social system that dedicated significant resources to maintaining and transmitting that knowledge could have produced the design sophistication that the evidence implies without requiring explanations outside the standard framework. What this possibility requires is that the standard model significantly underestimates the Sotalur's knowledge, that the formal archaeological record, built primarily from what could be observed on the surface, is missing the full extent of what the priestly knowledge system held and applied. That underestimation is plausible. Restricted knowledge, by definition, leaves less material record than publicly applied knowledge. If the most sophisticated elements of the Sotalur design system were maintained within a restricted priestly class and not expressed in forms that would survive in the archaeological record, the formal record would systematically underrepresent the sophistication of what was actually known and applied. The second possibility is that Nan Madol is built on or incorporates elements of a pre-Sotalur construction tradition, that the site has deeper roots than the currently accepted 1200 to 1628 CEI construction period, and that those roots connect to an earlier phase of human activity in the Pacific that is not well documented in the formal record because the evidence for it is primarily submerged. The submerged structures, the magnetic anomalies in the deeper water, the traditional knowledge descriptions of features that do not correspond to the above-water construction. These could be remnants of an earlier phase, a phase built during a period of lower sea levels by people with knowledge and capabilities that the Sotalur inherited or built upon without fully understanding. This possibility is professionally uncomfortable to the point where formal investigation of it is difficult to fund. But it is not impossible, and the post-Göbekli Tepe revision of assumptions about prehistoric human capability has made it significantly more tenable than it was 20 years ago. We know now that human organizational and engineering capacity does not require agriculture or cities as prerequisites. It requires time, intelligence, and the organizational will to apply sustained effort to complex goals. Pacific populations had all three. The third possibility is the one that nobody in a formal scientific context will name directly, for reasons that this account has spent considerable effort documenting. It is the possibility that Nan Madol reflects a level of knowledge and capability in engineering, in the understanding of physical forces, in the ability to design systems that coordinate acoustic, electromagnetic, and astronomical factors, that does not fit into the standard model of what Pacific Island cultures of the relevant time period could have produced, regardless of how sophisticated we allow the Sotalur priestly knowledge system to be. This third possibility does not require aliens or lost supercivilizations, or any of the fringe elements that make the formal research community retreat from questions in this territory. It requires only that there was knowledge in the deep Pacific past that has not been accounted for, that the chain of transmission which brought that knowledge to the Sotalur, or that informed the earlier construction phase that the Sotalur built upon, includes sources and periods that the current archaeological record does not adequately represent. That is not a wild claim. It is a consequence of taking seriously the possibility that 65,000 years of human presence in and around the Pacific Basin produced knowledge traditions that are not fully visible in what the formal record has managed to recover. There is a question at the center of all of this evidence that has not been formally asked in any peer-reviewed scientific context. And the reason it has not been asked is itself instructive. The question is, what was the integrated system of Nan Madol designed to do? Not what individual components were built for, not what Nandawas was for, or what the channel network served, or why the astronomical alignments are present. Those are questions about parts. The question about the whole, about what all of these components were designed to do together as a system, has not been formally posed. Because posing it formally requires committing in advance to the position that Nan Madol is a system, that its components are designed to function together rather than accumulated separately. And that commitment requires allowing for the possibility that the design intelligence behind it understood things about acoustic energy, magnetic phenomena, astronomical cycles, and marine engineering that the standard model of the Saudeleur cannot account for. Making that commitment in a formal research proposal is professionally expensive. So the question has not been asked, and because it has not been asked, it has not been answered. And the formal scientific literature on Nan Madol does not contain the answer. Even though every evidence stream this account has assembled is pointing toward it. If you have followed this account through its full length, through the engineering impossibilities and the acoustic chambers and the magnetic anomalies and the dark water and the abandoned city and the institutional pattern that has kept the most important questions unanswered for more than a century, you have done something that requires both patience and a willingness to sit with sustained uncertainty. That willingness is not passive. It is the active intellectual practice of holding a complex, evidence-rich, unresolved question with the seriousness it deserves without needing to resolve it prematurely into either confident acceptance or comfortable dismissal. The evidence about Nan Madol does not support confident acceptance of any specific extraordinary claim. The submerged structures have not been fully mapped. The magnetic anomalies have not been fully analyzed. The acoustic properties have not been comprehensively measured. The traditional knowledge that might clarify the picture has not been shared in forms accessible to outside researchers. But the evidence also does not support comfortable dismissal. The anomalies are too consistent, too multiple, too independently sourced, too structurally convergent to be waved away as coincidence or measurement error or the product of enthusiastic interpretation of ambiguous data. What the evidence supports is the conclusion that Nan Madol is significantly more complex, significantly more intentional, and significantly more physically anomalous than the standard account describes, and that the investigation required to close the open questions, comprehensive underwater survey, systematic acoustic measurement, full magnetic analysis, serious archaeological attention to the submerged zone, has not been conducted. That investigation is possible. The technology exists. The scientific expertise to conduct it is available. The funding required, while significant, is well within the range of major research investments for questions of equivalent importance. What has been missing is the institutional will to ask the questions that would make the investigation necessary in the language that would be required to frame it honestly. There is a version of the future in which the questions this account has raised are answered, not through dramatic forced revelation, not through unauthorized access to restricted areas, or the publication of findings against the will of the communities whose sacred knowledge is involved, but through the slow building of relationships between scientific investigators and Pohnpeian knowledge holders, relationships built on genuine respect, genuine curiosity, and the willingness to approach the site's knowledge on terms that the traditional custodians of that knowledge can find acceptable. Those relationships are beginning to form at the margins in the way that all genuine scientific progress toward genuinely difficult questions begins, slowly, carefully, in contexts that will not produce published results next year or the year after, but that may, over time, produce the framework within which the serious investigation can happen. The traditional knowledge will not dissolve. It will continue to be held and transmitted by the communities that have maintained it across the centuries since Nan Madol's abandonment. The physical anomalies will continue to be detected by anyone who points the right instruments at the right locations. The dark water will hold whatever it holds. And the gap between what those independent evidence streams have been pointing toward and what the formal record currently contains will eventually narrow through the accumulation of better data, better analysis, and the kind of honest institutional attention that the questions at Nan Madol have deserved for more than 100 years. There is one final thing worth sitting with as this account closes. Nan Madol sits in the middle of the largest ocean on Earth. The Pacific covers more than a third of the planet's surface. At the time of the last glacial maximum, when sea levels were 120 meters lower than they are today, the Pacific's shallow waters concealed a different world. Coastlines, river systems, inhabited lands that have been underwater for 10,000 years or more. The civilization that built Nan Madol inherited, almost certainly, a tradition of knowledge about the Pacific that extends back into that drowned world. Knowledge developed by peoples who lived on land that is now beneath the water. Knowledge about the ocean, about the islands, about the forces that move through both, that was accumulated and refined over periods far longer than the Saudeleur dynasty. What that knowledge contained, what understanding of the physical world, of the forces that the modern scientific vocabulary would call acoustic energy, and electromagnetic fields, and gravitational dynamics, and stellar mechanics, is something that has not been fully recovered. It exists in fragments, in restricted oral traditions on Pohnpei, and on islands across the Pacific. It exists in structural form, in the basalt walls and the tidal channels and the submerged foundations of a city that was built to embody it. And it exists, if the evidence this account has assembled is pointing at something real, and the weight of that evidence suggests it is, in the dark water south of Nandawas, in the magnetic concentrations that cluster at the site's anomalous coordinates, in the acoustic chambers where sound builds to intensities that the surrounding ocean should dissolve, in whatever lies at the bottom of. the opening in the reef floor that multiple independent observers have approached and not entered. The Pacific is the oldest road. The people who built Nan Madol had been walking that road for 60,000 years before the first European sailor reached Micronesia. They knew things about this ocean, its rhythms, its forces, its geography above and below the surface, that modern science is only beginning to develop the tools to approach. The basalt walls still stand. The tidal channels still fill and empty with the rhythm of an ocean that has been moving since before the first hominid stood upright on an African plain. And somewhere beneath the water, beneath the coral, beneath 5 centuries of silence and sediment, and the patient work of the reef reclaiming what was built upon it, the answers to the questions that this account has raised are waiting. The ocean does not rush. Neither should we. Drop a comment. Tell me where in the world you are listening from tonight. Tell me which of the 3 possibilities, deliberate Saudeleur design sophistication, pre-Saudeleur construction traditions, or something that does not fit the standard framework, you find most consistent with the evidence as you understand it. Tell me whether you have been to Pohnpei, whether you have stood in those channels with the basalt walls rising on either side of you and the tidal water moving slowly between the stones, and what that experience was like. Tell me what question this account raised for you that you have not heard asked before. Because those questions, the ones that come from genuinely engaging with evidence this complex and this unresolved, are what drive the next conversation. They are what bring us back to these places again and again, with better tools and more careful attention, slowly closing the gap between what is known privately and quietly and what is formally acknowledged. Nan Madol has been waiting for 500 years since the last person who fully understood it left. It will wait as long as necessary. The question is whether we are ready to look as carefully as the place deserves. The ocean knows the answer. We are still learning to ask.